The sun was beating down on the parade ground, its heat shimmering on the dust as though the earth itself wanted to crack open under the weight of discipline. Rows upon rows of soldiers stood at attention, boots anchored in the dirt, eyes fixed straight ahead, rifles held with the stiffness that came only after years of drill and endless correction. It was one of those mornings where tension lingered just below the surface, where even the smallest spark could ignite something uncontrollable. At the front, pacing with the authority of a man who believed he was untouchable, stood Colonel Raymond. He had commanded this battalion for years, feared more than respected, his reputation built less on tactical genius and more on brutality disguised as discipline. Behind him trailed the whisper of his legend, a man who believed obedience was forged not by loyalty but by fear. Yet in the middle of this parade ground, with 317 soldiers standing in absolute silence, one act would shatter that legend forever. Among those standing in formation was Lieutenant Zara, one of the very few female officers in a regiment that had long prided itself on tradition, on masculinity, on the belief that women could never endure the same rigors of command. She had earned her place not through favors but through blood, sweat, and a relentless refusal to bow before prejudice. Her peers respected her resilience, but the colonel did not. To him, she was a thorn in his pride, an unwanted reminder that the world was changing, and his authority, once unquestionable, could be challenged not by another man but by someone he considered lesser by nature. His hatred had festered quietly, masked behind curt remarks, impossible assignments and punishments disguised as drills. But on that morning, in front of every eye in the regiment, his contempt would erupt into violence, and receive an answer he never imagined. The colonel had summoned the battalion for what he called a demonstration of discipline. Soldiers whispered privately that such events were simply stages for him to exert dominance, to remind everyone who held power over their futures. He strode down the line, inspecting uniforms with hawk-like precision, stopping to humiliate anyone whose boot wasn't polished to a mirror finish or whose rifle didn't gleam under the sun. His voice carried like a whip, every word a lash designed to strip dignity. When he reached Zara's line, the silence deepened. Every soldier in that row stiffened, eyes locked forward, knowing instinctively that the colonel's attention would settle on her. He halted, eyes narrowing, lips curling into a thin smile that held no warmth. His boots scraped against the ground as he moved to stand directly in front of her. "Lieutenant," he said, his voice low but carrying easily across the formation. "Tell me, do you think you belong here among real soldiers?" His question was not meant to be answered, it was a dagger meant to slice her confidence, a performance for the battalion. Zara, standing tall, her uniform immaculate, did not flinch. Her jaw tightened, but her eyes remained steady. She had endured his barbs before, each one like a test, each one feeding the fire inside her. Yet something in the colonel's tone was different this time, heavier, as though he was preparing to cross a line no rank could protect him from. When she didn't respond, because regulations dictated silence unless addressed for orders, his temper flared. "Answer me," he barked, stepping closer, so close that his breath, thick with the bitter stench of tobacco, hit her face. "Do you think you belong here?" Still, she refused to break protocol. Her silence wasn't defiance, it was discipline. But to him it felt like resistance. And that was enough. Without warning, his hand rose, an open palm twisting into the promise of violence. Every soldier in that field saw it, the colonel's arm cocking back, his body preparing to strike her across the face, an act of humiliation intended to crush her in front of all. Time seemed to slow in that instant. Some soldiers gasped inwardly, others clenched their fists in anger but dared not move. A colonel striking a junior officer was unthinkable, yet here it was unfolding before their eyes. But before his hand could land, before his authority could be cemented by violence, Zara moved. Her training, reflexes, and years of pent-up resistance exploded in a single motion. With precision and speed that stunned even the most battle-hardened among them, she caught his wrist mid-swing. For a split second, shock painted his face, disbelief that she dared to stop him. But disbelief turned to agony as her grip tightened, twisting his arm with a force he had not anticipated. The snap echoed across the silent field like a rifle crack, sharp and final. His scream followed, raw and guttural, ripping through the air as he collapsed to his knees, clutching his broken arm, the authority he had clung to for decades shattering as quickly as the bone inside him. The soldiers, all 317 of them, stood frozen. Discipline had trained them not to move without command, but instinct screamed rebellion in their veins. They had witnessed the impossible, a colonel brought down not by an enemy bullet or the chaos of war, but by the defiance of a woman he had sought to break. Murmurs rippled through the ranks, restrained gasps breaking the silence. No one dared cheer, but in the eyes of many, there was a flicker of something dangerous. Respect, admiration, hope. Zara did not bask in it. She stood over him, her chest heaving, her hands still trembling from the force she had unleashed. She hadn't planned it, hadn't intended to humiliate him, but when faced with violence she had chosen not to be a victim. And in that choice she had redrawn the lines of power on that parade ground forever. The colonel's face was twisted in rage and pain, his pride bleeding faster than the nerves screaming in his shattered limb. "Arrest her!" he bellowed, spittle flying, his voice breaking under the weight of agony. Yet no one moved. Not a single soldier obeyed. The silence was louder than any mutiny. They looked at him, then at her, and understood in that instant where the true strength lay. The order hung in the air, unanswered, rotting like a fruit in the sun. His authority, once absolute, crumbled in real time before the eyes of the very men and women he thought he commanded. Zara knew the consequences of her action could be severe: court-martial, imprisonment, disgrace. But as she scanned the rows of faces staring back at her, she also knew something irreversible had happened. She had not just defended herself, she had shattered the illusion that fear was the only foundation of leadership. The colonel's broken arm was more than an injury, it was a symbol of the fragility of tyranny. And though the weight of what she had done pressed heavily on her shoulders, she stood unyielding, her gaze steady, her voice finally cutting through the silence. "A true leader does not raise a hand against their own," she said, her tone carrying to the last row. Her words didn't come from a place of triumph but of truth, a truth every soldier on that field had longed to hear spoken aloud. The colonel groaned, his breath ragged, his authority slipping through his fingers like sand. For the first time he was not feared. He was pitied. And for Zara, that was the moment she realized the battle had already been won, not by breaking his arm but by exposing his weakness before the eyes of 317 silent witnesses. The air was heavy, charged with the knowledge that nothing in the regiment would ever be the same again. The field remained cloaked in silence, but it was no longer the rigid silence of parade discipline. It was the stunned quiet of men and women who had just watched the impossible unfold and were trying to stitch their thoughts back together. The colonel was on his knees, his face pale, his teeth clenched against waves of pain that surged from his shattered arm. His other hand trembled as he clutched the limb against his chest, sweat dripping from his temples under the ruthless sun. For the first time in years, his voice had lost the thunder that once commanded obedience. Instead it cracked and broke like brittle glass. Soldiers shifted in their boots, some glancing nervously at one another, others daring to look directly at Zara. The formation had not broken, yet order had unraveled. Something powerful was brewing in the air, something dangerous for the hierarchy that had kept them bound in fear. Zara herself stood rigid, her breathing shallow but steady, her heart pounding like a war drum inside her chest. Every instinct told her that what she had done was both a crime and an act of survival. She had disobeyed no order, yet she had laid hands on her superior, and not just any superior but a colonel, a man whose connections reached far beyond the parade ground. She knew what was coming: accusations of insubordination, court-martial, perhaps even dishonorable discharge. And yet, staring down at him, watching his once commanding figure reduced to a trembling shell, she felt no regret. She had not struck him out of malice. She had defended herself from a blow that would have been both physical and symbolic, a strike intended to cement her subjugation before the eyes of her comrades. She had chosen not to be a victim, and now the weight of that choice settled over her like the scorching sun above. "Arrest her!" the colonel spat again, his voice hoarse, a mixture of rage and desperation. His order, repeated with even more venom, still hung in the air without answer. The 317 soldiers stared straight ahead, their discipline intact but their obedience fractured. Not one pair of boots moved toward her. His authority had bled out with the crack of his arm, and they all knew it. It was not loyalty to her that kept them frozen. It was the dawning realization that loyalty to him had already been shattered. To obey him now, to drag her away in shackles, would have been to betray their own sense of justice, their own buried resentment at years of cruelty. And so they stood still, unwilling to break ranks, unwilling to betray her. Zara's gaze swept the formation. She could see the conflict in their eyes. Men and women who had been trained to follow orders without hesitation now caught between fear of consequence and admiration for what they had just witnessed. She knew that if the colonel had commanded them to march into gunfire, they would have obeyed without question. But now, with his pride broken and his cruelty laid bare, his commands had lost their gravity. It was not her intention to turn the regiment against him, but she could sense it. The balance of power had shifted and it was not going back. She lowered her voice just enough to reach those nearest, her words cutting through the tension like steel. You all saw what he tried to do. Her tone was steady, not pleading, not fiery, but grounded in undeniable truth. No officer, no leader, has the right to raise his hand against one of his own. The colonel's face twisted with fury. Silence her, he roared, his good hand slamming against the ground as though the earth itself could deliver him obedience. But again no one moved. A ripple of unease passed through the soldiers, some shifting, others straightening, but the spell of fear was broken. He was no longer their unshakable figure. He was a man vulnerable, desperate, and exposed. He tried to rise, his body shaking with the effort, but his knees buckled and he slumped forward, cursing through clenched teeth. Sweat soaked his collar, his lips trembled, his eyes darted with a frantic edge. For the first time in years he was not feared. He was pitied. And in a soldier's world, pity was far more dangerous than hatred. An officer from the sidelines, Captain Raza, a man known for his cautious loyalty to whoever held power, finally stepped forward. His face was unreadable, his stride measured. He approached the colonel, then glanced at Zara, his eyes lingering for a fraction of a second longer than protocol allowed. He bent down beside the colonel, speaking in a low tone that only those closest could hear. Sir, you need medical attention. The bone is broken. His words were practical, but underneath them lay a quiet suggestion. This spectacle had gone far enough. The colonel glared at him, sweat dripping into his eyes. She will pay, he hissed, his voice weakened but still venomous. Raza didn't respond immediately. Instead, he gestured toward two medics waiting at the edge of the ground. They hesitated, glancing between Zara and the colonel, then moved forward quickly, kneeling beside the writhing officer. As the medics worked to secure his arm with a makeshift splint, Zara's mind churned. Every second that passed without her being seized was both a blessing and a tightening noose. The longer the silence stretched, the more it became clear that this was no longer about one act of defiance. It was about the soul of the regiment itself. Would they allow a tyrant to dictate by fear, or would they silently stand behind her, acknowledging the courage that had just defied him? She felt the stares drilling into her back. Every soldier in that formation was silently choosing a side, though none dared to voice it. The colonel's moans of pain filled the air, mingling with the restless shifting of boots on dirt. The atmosphere was suffocating. Finally, Captain Raza stood. His expression was careful, his voice neutral. Lieutenant Zara, he said, addressing her directly, you are to remain here until further notice. It was neither an arrest nor a dismissal, merely a placeholder in a moment where no one knew how to proceed. The colonel tried to protest, his face flushing with rage, but Raza raised his hand slightly, as though signaling that the matter would be dealt with later, behind closed doors. The medics lifted the colonel to his feet, his body slumping against them, his dignity in tatters. He was carried away toward the infirmary, his curses fading into the distance. And just like that, the parade ground was left in the hands of silence, 317 soldiers still standing in rigid formation, eyes forward, their minds ablaze with what they had just seen. When the colonel disappeared from sight, Zara's shoulders finally eased just slightly. She knew this was only the beginning. His injury would not erase his power, it would provoke his fury. He would move heaven and earth to see her punished, not just for defiance but for humiliation. Yet as she scanned the faces of her comrades, she realized she was not alone. They had seen the truth with their own eyes, and truth, once revealed, could not be undone. Some looked at her with awe, others with quiet fear of what her act might bring upon them all, but no one looked away. She had become a symbol in that instant, whether she wanted it or not. And symbols were harder to destroy than people. That night, as the camp settled under the weight of rumors and hushed conversations, Zara sat alone in her quarters. Her hands trembled now, the adrenaline gone, the enormity of what she had done pressing down on her. The voices outside carried through the thin walls, soldiers whispering in disbelief, speculating about what tomorrow would bring. Some spoke of punishment, others of change, but all agreed on one thing: they had witnessed history. She closed her eyes, leaning back against the bunk, her body weary yet her mind sharp. The colonel would come for her. The institution would demand retribution. But somewhere deep inside, she felt a flicker of certainty. No matter what came, the ground had shifted. And nothing, not even a colonel's fury, could turn back what had been unleashed before the eyes of 317 witnesses. The following morning dawned heavy with anticipation, the camp buzzing long before the bugle call. Whispers spread through the barracks like wildfire, traveling from cot to cot. lips pressed close to ears as soldiers shared the story again and again, each retelling sharper, more charged. They spoke of the colonel's hand rising, of Zara's reflexes like lightning, of the sound of bones snapping that still echoed in their minds. Some recounted it with awe, others with dread, but none denied that they had seen something unforgettable. The number 317 was repeated like a vow. Every single one of them had borne witness. No rumor, no official statement could erase what they had seen with their own eyes. Yet beneath the murmurs was the chill of fear, for all knew the colonel was not a man who accepted humiliation quietly. He would strike back, and when he did, his vengeance would be ruthless. Zara awoke to the sound of boots outside her quarters. Her rest had been shallow, broken by fragments of dreams where she was dragged away in chains, or where she stood alone in front of a firing squad, unflinching as the rifles raised. She rose slowly, her uniform already laid out, pressed with the precision she had drilled into herself since the academy. Her body felt heavy, but her resolve remained solid. She knew today would bring confrontation, though in what form she could not predict. The knock on her door came sharp and authoritative. She opened it to find two military police officers standing stiffly, their expressions carefully blank. "Lieutenant Zarawan," one said, his tone flat, "you are requested at headquarters immediately." Not arrested, not ordered, requested. The wording was deliberate, meant to suggest civility while hiding the steel edge beneath. She nodded once, grabbed her cap, and followed them into the rising light of dawn. The walk through camp was suffocating. Soldiers lined her path, some openly staring, others glancing quickly then turning away, as though eye contact itself might make them complicit. Conversations hushed as she passed. She could feel the weight of their gazes, the unspoken questions in their eyes. Was she a hero or a doomed rebel? Was she to be punished as an example or protected as a symbol? She kept her back straight, her pace measured, her eyes locked forward. She could not afford hesitation, not here, not now. Every movement was under scrutiny. When they reached headquarters, the officers led her through corridors where the smell of polished wood and stale air mixed with the faint tang of ink and dust. Finally they stopped before a set of double doors. One officer knocked once and without waiting for a reply, opened it. "Enter," he said. Inside, the room was dim, blinds half closed against the morning sun. At the center sat a tribunal of 3 senior officers, their uniforms crisp, their faces severe. At the far end, seated at a table with his arm bound in a heavy cast, was Colonel Raymond. His eyes burned into her with venom, the lines of his face etched deeper by sleepless rage. His presence turned the air thick. He didn't speak, his silence was heavier than any accusation. The senior officer in the middle, a brigadier with cold eyes and a voice like gravel, gestured toward the chair opposite. "Lieutenant Awan. Sit." Zara obeyed, lowering herself with deliberate calm. She refused to fidget, refused to allow them the satisfaction of seeing nerves. Her palms pressed against her thighs beneath the table, steadying herself as the brigadier leaned forward. "You stand accused of assaulting a superior officer," he began, his words precise, clipped. "An act punishable by dismissal, imprisonment, or worse depending on the circumstances. Do you deny this?" Zara's eyes flicked once toward the colonel, then back to the brigadier. "I do not deny my actions," she said evenly. "But I will not accept the charges framed. I did not attack. I defended myself." A murmur ran through the room. The 2 officers flanking the brigadier shifted in their seats, exchanging glances. The colonel's lips curled into something between a sneer and a grimace. His good hand clenched the edge of the table, knuckles whitening. The brigadier's eyes narrowed. "Defended yourself? From what?" Zara straightened. "From an unlawful strike. The colonel attempted to hit me in front of the entire battalion." Her words dropped like stones in water, ripples spreading through the silence. The brigadier's gaze sharpened. "And you expect us to take your word against that of a decorated officer?" It was then that she spoke the truth that made the tribunal shift uneasily. "Not just my word," she said. 317 soldiers saw it. Every man and woman on that parade ground witnessed it. Ask them. For a moment, the silence was deafening. The brigadier's lips pressed into a thin line, his jaw working as he considered. To summon 317 witnesses would not just be cumbersome. It would risk the truth spreading beyond control. Already rumors had spread through camp like fire through dry brush. To give them a platform to acknowledge their testimony would ignite something the higher command feared most, a collective voice. Colonel Raymond's face flushed deep crimson, fury and humiliation warring across his features. "They will not testify against me," he spat, his voice cracking. They fear me. Zara turned her gaze directly upon him, her voice steady as steel. Not anymore. The brigadier silenced them both with a raised hand. His voice was colder now, more dangerous. Regardless of witnesses, the fact remains. You injured your superior officer. That alone is grounds for severe punishment. Zara inhaled slowly, holding his gaze. Then let the record show the full truth. He raised his hand to strike me and I acted on instinct. If the law demands I be punished for that, so be it. But understand this, if I had allowed him to strike, it would not have been discipline. It would have been an abuse of power. And every soldier present knows it. Her words carried the weight of conviction, unshaken by the threat before her. The officers exchanged glances again, discomfort flickering in their eyes. They were not blind. They knew the colonel's reputation, knew the fear he instilled, and knew too that fear alone no longer held sway. The problem was no longer about discipline. It was about control, and control was slipping. The tribunal adjourned after hours of questioning, her answers measured, her composure unwavering. She was escorted back to her quarters, not in chains but not free either. She was told to await further orders, her fate hanging in the balance. Outside, the whispers grew louder. Soldiers who had once kept their heads down now lingered in groups, speaking openly of what they had seen, of what might happen next. Some warned that she would be crushed, that the system would protect the colonel at all costs. Others, emboldened, whispered of change, of courage, of the possibility that fear might no longer bind them. The camp was alive with a tension more volatile than any battlefront. That evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, Zara sat on the edge of her bunk, staring at the wall. The day had been long, her body exhausted, yet her mind was sharper than ever. She knew she had lit a fire she could not control. Whether it consumed her or illuminated a path for others remained to be seen. A knock at her door startled her. She opened it to find Sergeant Malik, a veteran soldier respected by nearly everyone in the regiment, standing there. His face was grim but his eyes held something else, resolve. He stepped inside, closing the door quietly behind him. "Lieutenant," he said, his voice low, "the men are talking. They saw what happened. They know the truth. And many of them, they stand with you." Zara blinked, surprised. Stand with me? Or against him? Malik's mouth tightened into a line. These days there's no difference. She sat back, absorbing his words. For the first time since the incident she felt the weight lift, if only slightly. She was not alone. Yet she also knew the danger of such unity. If soldiers began to side with her openly, the higher command would see not just an act of defiance but the seed of mutiny. And mutiny was crushed without mercy. Still, Malik's presence reminded her that what she had done had meaning beyond survival. She had struck more than an arm, she had struck fear itself. Now the question loomed like a storm on the horizon. Could she survive the tempest that would inevitably follow? She looked at Malik, her voice quiet but steady. "Then we must be careful. This isn't about me. It's about all of us." He nodded slowly. "Careful, yes. But sometimes, Lieutenant, careful is not enough." As night fell and the camp settled into uneasy rest, Zara lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The tribunal had not yet decided her fate, but the decision was already being shaped, not in the hands of 3 officers, but in the murmurs of 317 soldiers whose faith had shifted. The colonel's authority was bleeding, and with every whisper, every glance exchanged in secrecy, it weakened further. Change had already begun, and whether it ended in her ruin or in something greater, Zara knew one truth above all. Nothing would ever return to what it had been before. The colonel's recovery was swift in body but slow in pride. His arm remained bound in plaster and suspended by a sling, but his mind never stopped churning, feeding on humiliation like dry tinder soaking in oil. Each hour that passed after the incident on the parade ground deepened his fury, carving lines into his face sharper than any scar of war. He had been a man feared and obeyed without hesitation for years, and in a single moment before the eyes of hundreds, that fear had cracked. He told himself it was only temporary, that he would restore control, that the chain of command would crush Zara beneath the weight of regulation and law. Yet no matter how he tried to convince himself, the image returned to him endlessly, her hand catching his wrist, the sharp sound of bones snapping, the way silence had stretched across the parade ground while 317 soldiers refused to move at his command. That silence haunted him more than the pain in his arm. It was proof of something he dared not name, that fear alone no longer held them. In the dim light of his quarters, he summoned his closest aides. Men who owed their careers to his patronage came swiftly, their faces tense, their eyes betraying the unease that now followed him like a shadow. They listened as he spoke, his voice gravelly with rage, each word bitten off like a curse. This lieutenant thinks she can defy me before the entire battalion. She thinks she can shame me. His good hand slammed the table, rattling the glass of water beside him. I will see her destroyed. Not just punished, destroyed. One aide, a major with slick hair and a nervous habit of tapping his pen, ventured cautiously, "Sir, the tribunal may handle it." To push further might draw unwanted attention from higher command. The colonel's eyes snapped to him, burning with such intensity that the major immediately fell silent, his throat dry. "Do you think I care for their attention?" Raymond growled. "This is not about discipline. This is about power. If I do not crush her, if I do not make an example, then every soldier who watched will believe they can challenge me. And I will not tolerate that." His aides nodded, though none spoke further. They understood the danger of contradicting him in this state. The colonel's pride had always been volatile, but now it was a live wire, sparking dangerously close to collapse. He leaned back, his face twisting with thought. If the tribunal does not condemn her, then we will find another way. She will not walk out of this camp with her rank intact. His words hung in the air, thick with threat. Behind his bravado, however, a deeper truth gnawed at him. The tribunal had been shaken. The officers had heard Zara's calm words, had been reminded of their own doubts about his methods, their own unease with his reign of fear. If they failed to punish her harshly, it would be a tacit admission that his authority had faltered. And so he plotted, sleepless, fueled by rage and humiliation. Meanwhile, in the soldiers' barracks, Zara's name spread like a whisper of rebellion. Men and women who had once spoken only of drills and duty now found themselves murmuring about justice, about courage. Some were afraid that her act would bring ruin on them all, that the colonel's wrath would fall like a hammer on the entire regiment. But others spoke with fire in their voices, quietly defiant, their respect for her growing with each retelling of the story. Sergeant Malik became an unofficial voice among them, careful to temper excitement with caution. He reminded them that open defiance was suicide, that the system would crush them if they acted rashly. But even he could not stop the shift in spirit. Soldiers who had once kept their heads down now lifted them a little higher. Fear was loosening its grip, and in its place was something the colonel could not command: belief. Zara herself remained under what they called restricted movement. She was not confined to a cell, but she was closely watched, her every step reported. Guards trailed her at a discreet distance, their presence a constant reminder of the precarious line she walked. She spent her hours training alone, pushing her body through routines that steadied her mind. Each push-up, each strike against the punching bag was a reminder that strength was still hers to hold. Yet beneath her discipline was an undercurrent of anxiety she would not show. She knew the colonel would not let the matter rest. His pride was too deep, his need for dominance too consuming. He would come for her, if not through the tribunal then through darker means. She prepared herself for that inevitability, even as exhaustion gnawed at her resolve. One evening, as the sky darkened and the camp settled into uneasy quiet, Captain Raza appeared at her door. His face was unreadable, his uniform immaculate as always. She let him in, studying him with caution. He had always been careful, a man who chose survival over ideals, aligning himself with power rather than principle. Yet now, his presence carried an edge she had not seen before. "Lieutenant," he began, his voice low, "you need to understand the danger you're in. The colonel has not stopped speaking of you since that day. He wants blood." Zara met his gaze, her expression steady. "I expected nothing less." Raza's jaw tightened. "No, you don't understand. He doesn't just want you dismissed. He wants you broken. He is already pulling strings, speaking to contacts above, twisting the narrative. If he succeeds, your career, your life, will be crushed under the weight of accusations you cannot disprove." She listened, her chest tightening. "Then why are you here?" she asked quietly. Raza hesitated. "Because I've seen enough to know the truth. You didn't strike him out of ambition or arrogance. You defended yourself. And because the men believe in you. More than you realize. They talk about you like a flame in the dark. If he destroys you, he destroys their hope. And if that happens, the regiment will fracture." His words were cautious, as though he himself was still uncertain whether to throw his lot in with her. Zara studied him, her instincts measuring the weight of his sincerity. At last she said, "Then you must choose. Continue standing beside him, or stand for what you know is right." Raza's lips pressed into a thin line, his eyes flickering with conflict. "I'm not ready to answer that," he admitted. "But I came to warn you. Be ready. He will strike soon." The warning proved true sooner than expected. Within days, orders circulated that Zara was to face a formal military trial, not just a tribunal. The stakes were higher now, the language sharper. She was accused not only of assaulting a superior but of undermining discipline, of inciting disobedience through her actions. The charges reeked of the colonel's hand, a carefully woven net meant to strangle her. The announcement hit the camp like a shockwave. Soldiers who had once whispered in awe now whispered in fear. A trial of that magnitude was not simply about one officer, it was about making an example. If Zara was condemned, it would serve as a warning to anyone who dared question authority again. The fire she had lit would be snuffed out. Zara stood in her quarters, reading the official document, her hands steady despite the storm inside her. She knew the game now. The colonel was not interested in justice. He was interested in erasure. He wanted her name struck from memory, her courage recast as betrayal. And yet, even as the walls closed in, she felt a strange calm. She could not control the outcome of a trial manipulated by power, but she could control her stance within it. She would not beg. She would not cower. She would speak the truth no matter how it was twisted. For if 317 soldiers had seen her defiance, then 317 soldiers would carry her truth, no matter what verdict was forced upon her. That night, as the camp lay under a heavy silence, Zara walked to the training ground, the moonlight casting long shadows over the dirt. She stood alone, breathing deeply, her fists clenched at her sides. The colonel might control the court, but he could not control what had already happened, what every soldier had seen. And that thought, more than any sentence they could impose, gave her strength. She closed her eyes, hearing again the crack of bone, the silence that followed, the refusal of 317 soldiers to obey his order. That silence was her shield. That silence was her proof. Whatever storm was coming, she would face it head-on. And somewhere in the shadows of the camp, unseen eyes watched her. Men loyal to the colonel, waiting, listening, preparing to act. For him, the trial was not enough. He wanted her crushed in spirit before the gavel fell. The game had only just begun, and the battlefield was no longer the parade ground but the soul of the regiment itself. The night after the duel, silence fell over the camp in a way that felt almost unnatural. Even the usual clatter of boots, the hum of conversations around the fire pits, and the occasional bursts of laughter seemed to have been swallowed by the weight of what had happened. 317 soldiers had witnessed their colonel humiliated and broken, and none of them knew what tomorrow would bring. Some whispered that Lena would be executed at dawn, others swore the general himself would arrive and strip her rank. But beneath the tension, a deeper undercurrent had already begun to stir. Admiration, a kind of fierce loyalty she had never sought but had earned in that one violent moment. Lena, however, did not feel triumphant. In the quiet of her barracks, she sat with her knuckles raw from impact and her muscles trembling, not from exhaustion but from the knowledge that the consequences of what she had done were only beginning. She stared at her hands, remembering the sharp crack of the colonel's arm breaking, the sound echoing in her ears like a drumbeat. It hadn't been planned. It hadn't even been a choice in the conscious sense. It was instinct, survival, her body reacting when his hand swung toward her face. But instincts had consequences, and now she was the soldier who had crippled a superior officer before the eyes of the entire regiment. The door creaked open and Sergeant Veyer stepped inside, his tall frame blocking the torchlight from the hall. His expression was tight, unreadable, but his eyes flicked toward her bruised knuckles before landing on her face. "The men are waiting for orders," he said quietly. "Not his orders. Yours." Lena shook her head, incredulous. "I'm no officer. I don't give orders." "You already did," Veyer replied, his tone clipped but steady. "When you stood your ground. When you fought back. You showed them that his authority ends where abuse begins. You think those men will follow him now, after what they saw? He's finished. The only question is what happens next, and whether you're ready to face it." She swallowed hard, her throat dry. The idea of leading terrified her more than the fight itself had. She hadn't joined the army to command. She had joined to survive, to carve out some semblance of freedom in a world where choices for people like her were limited. Leadership was something that carried responsibility, danger, and visibility, none of which she had ever craved. Yet as she sat in that dim barracks, Lena realized the decision was no longer hers alone. The men had seen the colonel fall. They had seen her strength. Whether she wanted it or not, they would look to her now, if not for leadership, then for guidance in a moment of chaos. Refusing to step into that space might only invite more bloodshed, more punishment, more oppression from whatever officer was sent next. By morning, rumors had spread beyond the regiment. The camp buzzed with talk of the soldier who had broken the colonel's arm, the woman who had stood unflinching before the chain of command and shattered it with a single act of defiance. Some said she was a hero, others whispered she was doomed, but all agreed on one thing: nothing in the regiment would ever be the same. When the general's envoy arrived, a convoy of black-painted transport vehicles rolling into the camp with banners snapping in the wind, every soldier lined up in tense formation. Lena stood among them, her pulse thundering in her ears as the envoy stepped out, a stern-faced commander named Marshal Run, known for his ruthless enforcement of discipline. His gaze swept over the soldiers, sharp as a blade, before landing on her. "You," he said, his voice cutting through the silence. "Step forward." Lena obeyed, her boots crunching on the gravel as hundreds of eyes followed her. She expected to be bound, dragged away, maybe even executed on the spot. Instead, Marshal Run studied her for a long, unnerving moment before speaking again. "I have heard of what you did. The colonel struck at you and you retaliated. Discipline broken. Command humiliated. Such things are not tolerated." His words rang with authority, and several soldiers stiffened as if bracing for a verdict. But then his tone shifted, almost imperceptibly. Yet, 317 soldiers stood witness. And not one intervened on his behalf. Not one condemned your act. Do you know why that is? Lena's mouth was dry. She forced herself to answer. Because they saw what he was. Marshal Run's lips twitched, not quite a smile, but something close to it. Indeed. A leader without honor is no leader at all. The army is not built on fear, it is built on respect. You, soldier, have reminded this regiment of that truth. And for that, he paused, letting the silence hang heavy. You will not be punished. A ripple of shock swept through the ranks. Lena blinked, scarcely believing what she'd heard. But before relief could settle, Run raised his voice again. However, the regiment cannot remain without command. You, Lena Vera, will assume temporary authority until a new colonel is assigned. Your strength has earned you their eyes. Let us see if it has earned you their loyalty. The weight of his words struck her like a hammer. Authority. Responsibility. The very thing she had feared. She wanted to protest, to insist she was not fit, but the looks on the soldiers' faces stopped her. They were not mocking nor resentful. They were watching her with something else entirely: hope. For men who had lived under tyranny and humiliation, even a moment of fairness was enough to kindle a fire. That night the camp transformed. Soldiers who had once kept their distance now approached her with quiet words of respect, some even offering to stand guard at her quarters. Veer remained close, his steady presence both reassuring and challenging, reminding her that leadership was not about power but about responsibility. The colonel, meanwhile, had been transported away for medical treatment, his arms splinted, his career in tatters. His absence felt like a void, but it was a void quickly filled by the trust Lena had unwillingly inherited. Still, she knew this was only the beginning. For every soldier who admired her, there would be officers beyond the camp who saw her as a threat to the chain of command, a dangerous symbol of rebellion. Her survival would depend not only on her strength but on her ability to balance defiance with discipline, to prove that she was more than just a fighter who had broken an arm. She had to show she could build something in the aftermath. And in the flicker of firelight, as the soldiers gathered around her for the first time, not as a fellow recruit but as a figure they trusted, Lena realized something else. The fear that had always gnawed at her, the fear of standing out, of becoming a target, was slowly being replaced by something she had never allowed herself to feel before: purpose. For the first time in her life, she was no longer just surviving. She was leading. And that, she knew, was the most dangerous battle of all. The infirmary was still lit with the sterile white glow of fluorescent lamps when Alara walked in, her boots echoing softly on the tiles. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic, a sharp scent that mingled with the iron tang of dried blood and bandages. On one side of the room, Colonel Draven lay restrained, his face pale but twisted with fury even as morphine dulled the pain in his broken arm. He had not spoken since the medics forced him into a stretcher, but his silence was more venomous than any shouted order. On the other side, 3 young privates whispered nervously, their voices carrying the weight of gossip and awe. They looked up when Alara entered, their eyes wide, and then quickly looked away, as if her presence reminded them of the fragility of the chain of command they had always taken for granted. She ignored them and went straight to the doctor's desk, where Captain Rourke leaned against the wall, arms folded, eyes following her with quiet calculation. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low but firm. "The colonel's pride is bleeding worse than his arm, and you being in the same room won't help. Ilara's jaw clenched, though her gaze remained fixed on the unconscious rhythm of the heart monitor beeping beside Draven's cot. I didn't come here for him. I came because I need answers. Her voice was calm, but under its stillness lay a current of tension that pulled at every word. Rourke tilted his head, studying her. Answers about what? You already proved yourself in front of every soldier on that field. You showed them that rank doesn't excuse cruelty. What more do you think you need? The men, Ilara said simply. There were 317 of them. They saw me snap a colonel's arm like it was kindling. Half of them will call me a savior. Half will call me a monster. Which half matters depends on what happens next. For a moment, silence hung heavy in the infirmary. The doctor busied himself with paperwork, pretending not to hear, but the privates in the corner leaned forward, hungry for scraps of information, their ears straining as though this conversation carried the weight of destiny itself. Rourke exhaled, his expression hardening. You think Draven will let this go? He said finally. He's the kind of man who feeds on humiliation. He'll gnaw at this until he finds a way to twist it back on you. Don't fool yourself into thinking justice will protect you here. The military isn't built on justice, it's built on hierarchy, and you just tore a hole through it in broad daylight. Ilara turned her eyes from Draven's cot at last, meeting Rourke's gaze. Her eyes were sharp, but there was a tiredness in them, a shadow of the years she had endured in silence before this one moment of defiance. Then I'll stand by what I did, she said. If they court-martial me, so be it. But at least every one of those soldiers knows that no man, no officer, has the right to raise a hand against one of his own. Not anymore. Not while I still draw breath. Rourke studied her in silence as though weighing the steel in her words. Finally he gave a single nod, slow and deliberate. Then you're going to need allies. Because the colonel already has them. Before Ilara could answer, the infirmary doors slammed open with the force of a storm. A squad of military police marched in, their boots pounding the floor in unison. At their head strode Major Cashin, Draven's closest confidant, a man whose loyalty to the colonel was well known and whose cold precision made soldiers shiver when his name was spoken. His uniform was immaculate, his gloves spotless, and his eyes like twin blades as they swept across the room and landed on Ilara.